People interacting with people, individually and in groups, as friends or sometimes foes. A fascinating, never-ending source of study material for social psychologists.
Social psychology deals with how we view and affect one another,
which is how people are influenced by the actual and implied presence of others.
It is not the individual in isolation. It is not the individual in relation to the physical world. It's the individual in relation to the social world.
And so that involves studies of our attitudes, how we think about other people, conformity and group influence, and then how we relate to one another, sometimes aggressively, sometimes helpfully, sometimes feeling hate and dislike, prejudice, other times feeling love. What's behind each of those states?
Think for a moment about the people you observe in a single day. What judgments are you forming about them? And on what basis?
Human beings have become very good detectives, very good at taking somebody's behavior and figuring out what it really means about them. What kinds of traits that made them act the way they did, what kinds of motives, what kinds of thoughts, what kinds of feelings they're experiencing. Now, without a meat cleaver, you never really know what people are like deep down inside, and so you have to use an inferential process to find out. That process is called attribution, and attribution theorists spent half a century figuring out the inferential rules that everyday folks use to decode, to penetrate, if you will, the behavior of others.
If I hit somebody, why do I hit them? It's because I'm aggressive. So it's a trait, it's a quality in me that causes me to act that way. But I think when you look at things in a more relative way, in a way that sort of mixes motivation and responsibility and influence, then you see, well, yeah, he did an act that is aggressive, but there are many other ways of explaining that and understanding it. There are many other forces at work here.
I'm just saying, you don't look like you're on welfare, that's all.
You think you're better than me because you're sitting behind this desk? You don't know what
the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to incorrectly infer that another person's behavior was caused by their dispositions, when in fact it was actually caused by the situation. So, a simple example. If you bring people into a laboratory and you assign one person to play the role of contestant and another to play the role of quizmaster, and you have them play a little quiz game in which the quizmaster gets to make up hard questions and the contestant tries to answer them, predictably, the contestant fails. The contestant does miserably. People invariably, they think the quizmaster is much smarter than the contestant. Indeed, even contestants make that mistake. So this is an example of taking somebody's behavior and assuming that it tells you something about their enduring properties, in this case their intelligence, when in fact that behavior tells you nothing about anything except the situation in which they found themselves.
The struggle to explain or at least understand the actions of others, to understand what is unfolding around us, poses a constant challenge.
I've often thought that it would be interesting to follow an immigrant in New York City on their first day of arrival and ask them at the end of the day a few simple questions that would allow us to know if even in a 24-hour period they've somehow figured out through their wanderings about town that there's something about grocery store owners being Korean, newspaper stands having South Asians, tall white men with briefcases going into tall buildings, receptionists being female. These are associations about what type of person does what kind of work that is hard for us not to learn. So what do we do when the very thing that makes us intelligent, people who acquire, absorb, and learn, also be the ones who then fall prey to biases that exaggerate this knowledge or have it incorrectly?
Stereotypes, by definition, are assuming things about people that you didn't really see in that individual. So if we see someone with a certain skin color, or if they're older or younger, or if they have an accent, or they're from a certain country, if they wear certain kinds of clothes, we make assumptions about them, even though there's nothing that they did necessarily that show that that's true of them. Now, why do we do it? Well, it's sort of an outgrowth of the general tendency that we have to simplify, to use shortcuts, to understand and make predictions about what people are going to be like.
Not only do we assign traits to people that they may not have, we may also fail to appreciate the impact of context on behavior.
The cells, sleeping in rooms with bars on them, that there'll be constant surveillance.
You'd be surprised what your brain is capable of if it's put in the right context. As Phil Zimbardo showed, where students were arbitrarily told that, well, one of them is in jail and the other one is the jailer. And at the end of a week of this new context, this new situation, the way that they were treating each other was something that they would have never done in everyday life, but they did it because they were in a new context, unusual and a strange context.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress.
You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part. That's your costume. You have to act accordingly.
The more we learn about the influence of the social context, the more we appreciate that it's not just an add-on. It's not a layer that you can look at later. It's fundamentally changing the mixture of the cake that we thought we were studying initially. Same kind of research that showed that, we're so obedient to authority. Solomon Asch's work. We conform to other people's behaviors. Also demonstrated that if one person says no, conformity breaks down. Ian Milgram's research on obedience to authority, if one person objected, overcame, resisted that influence, others would also refuse. And so it seems that even though the situation is powerful, one of the evolutions of social psychology over the last 30 years or so is that we also see the power of an individual to step out of that situational influence and impact all the others in that situation.
In the Neil incident, you have a helicopter pilot coming in with a gunship, and his task is to smoke out the Viet Cong so that the other gunships can wipe him out. So he's there really on a killing mission. He glances down and he sees a girl who's been injured, and he calls down to the battalion commander to help her, and he sees him spray her with bullets. And then he glances and he sees a mother in the door, terrified, holding an infant, and a terrified child clinging to her leg. So he lowers his helicopter in the line of the soldiers and instructs his gunner to turn his guns on the approaching soldiers if they plan to hurt the family. And so he says that when I saw the look of terror in her face, there was nothing I could do otherwise.
Even though a single determined individual can exert power over a group, it is membership in a group that tends to have greater significance.
A socially shared understanding is crucial to functioning in a group. If you ask me what time it is and I punch you in the face, that's not a socially shared understanding of what one does in a certain circumstance. When people go to a different culture and they don't understand the culture and they don't know what to do, they can't communicate, they can't coordinate, they can't be efficient, they can't get fed, nothing, So one of the first things that groups do is develop a socially shared definition of who they are and what their purpose is, what their vocabulary is, their social structure, everything.
It's natural for human beings to prefer those who are like them, who belong to them, either by blood or by whatever proxy of blood there is. I think those are very natural. So we prefer people like us. We prefer people we're more comfortable with. We're skeptical about outsiders.
And people are quite distressed when they don't have a socially shared understanding with other people. So, if you're the only one in the world who thinks today is Friday, that's a little upsetting, and people will go to great lengths to figure out why they're the only one that thinks that, and eventually they'll just give up and say, well, it must be Tuesday, even though I thought for sure it was Friday.
Even when we're not being told what to do, the behavior of those we're with can be contagious, as John Barge and his colleagues observed in a group of experiments. Here, a volunteer is asked to comment on a series of pictures.
We staged it so the Confederate would either be sitting like I am and shaking her foot a little nervously, or while she was looking at the pictures, pulling on her ear or touching her face, something like this. And what we did was to secretly videotape the interaction and measure how much the actual participant took on the behaviors of the person that she was working with or he was working with without realizing it.
This inclination for people to conform without conscious intent was also tested at the Research Center for Virtual Environments and Behavior.
And the way we studied conformity was by building an immersive virtual casino with a blackjack game. We had a player come into the virtual casino, and they played blackjack alone for a while. And then there was a second session in which they played with two other people. We had the others bet around $5 more or $5 less than their average bet. And so we were able to produce the conformity effect. And we were able to produce the conformity effect whether or not the participants thought that the other human representations in the virtual world were actually avatars, which is what we label digital representation of an actual person, or agents. Didn't make any difference. There was still conformity.
People often go to great lengths to protect their standing in the group, even if it means adjusting their behavior to fit some standard or norm.
We're always sort of assessing and calculating, sometimes at a very semi-conscious level. Well, this person could think this, and I want this to happen, so I'm going to say that. A student could walk into my office and start talking about music that they listen to, and I could all of a sudden feel like, well, I don't want to look like I'm such an old and out-of-it person, and that person is young, I'm older. They could think that about me. So I'll maybe, this is all unconscious, semi-conscious, but maybe I'll mention the latest hit that I know about. And usually it's the mentioning of that very hit that signals that you don't know what you're talking about.
It's evident that groups impact our behavior. But just how far can this influence take us?
Social facilitation effects are the oldest effects in experimental social psychology. And we know from over 100 years of research that when people are performing a well-learned task, the presence of others actually increases their performance or improves it. When they're performing a not well-learned or novel task, the presence of other actually decreases it.
If you had to get up and give a public speech, if you were being interviewed, a little bit of arousal because of social presence might improve performance, especially on simple tasks. But too much and the performance degrades.
What tends to happen when a group becomes aroused and the situation starts to deteriorate?
People can get caught up in a crowd, lose their individuality, lose their self-regulatory capacity, and they quit thinking about themselves and their own morals as an individual, and they start reacting to the situation of the group. And people can get caught up in crowds and do things that they otherwise wouldn't do.
It's either due to conformity or de-individuation, a loss of identification, a kind of a lowering of social norms of what's appropriate, an influence of watching others, kind of a social modeling. And so they can get carried away in that influence. Are they really responsible? Are they culpable for the behavior in that context? And that's a difficult question.
What happens when people have the chance to work not just in the presence of others, but with others toward a shared goal? Do people tend to contribute less because a group is involved, as social loafing research seems to suggest? What motivates them to participate at all?
Say you want better wages. Well, you could participate in a movement for better wages, but that would take time, energy, you jeopardize your safety. If the movement wins, then you're going to get those benefits whether you participate or not. If the movement loses, you're going to be out your time and energy and safety and so on. So the real question for social movement theorists has been, why do people participate rather than free ride? And of course, there are a variety of explanations. I think some of the most interesting are that, one, people participate because they know other people who are participating. Now, that gives them information, right? You hear about a demonstration because your friend is going to the demonstration. But what we also know is that people tend to participate because they have a kind of loyalty, a sense of obligation to people who are already in the movement. So what we see in the case of the civil rights movement, for example, is that often whole congregations could be mobilized to participate because they had a kind of allegiance to their minister, they had an allegiance to each other. Another striking finding is that sometimes people participate before they even have a stake in the issue. So one study of protest here at Columbia against apartheid found that people kind of wandered into a demonstration without much knowing what it was about, what the issues were, why one should participate, and then being involved in the movement began to give them a sense that this was important and that they in fact had an interest in this movement and in this demonstration. Finally, we know that people gain benefits from participating itself. Participation becomes an end in itself. So a study of peasant movements in El Salvador found that the very act of participating gave people a sense of dignity that had been denied them.
How do people who are on the opposite sides of such issues perceive each other?
How do pro-choice people perceive pro-life and the like? And a variety of different studies have shown that there's almost a little switch that goes off in the mind. That the minute you know somebody is from a different side, you think that they are extremist, you think that they are irrational and don't handle evidence and empirical notions well, and you think, regrettably, that there's no common ground, when in fact all the studies show that in many different ways, people of different political groups share certain assumptions or certain fundamental beliefs. And so you can see how this tendency to construe the other group as an enemy can have a lot of regrettable consequences.
However, nothing pulls diverse factions together as much as a common enemy.
As Americans, we get attacked, and we all of a sudden feel very American. And we're willing in that moment to overlook differences that would otherwise, we would wrangle about. And it brings together a lot of points of views.
But this understandable desire for a united front can get in the way of more considered judgments. Judgments based on a thorough analysis of relevant facts and a respect for alternate points of view. The results can be catastrophic, as we saw when the Challenger space shuttle exploded.
Well, there were two questions about the accident right from the beginning. The first was there was a controversial teleconference the night before the Challenger launch in which worried engineers at the contractors argued that they shouldn't go the next day because the temperature was going to be an unprecedented low. And managers overrode the engineers' objections and went ahead with the launch anyway.
Just why? Investigators asked.
Just because NASA's a government agency doesn't mean that it isn't still competitive and trying to meet deadlines. They had been flying with flaws on the O-rings, which were the cause of the accident, for years, and in retrospect, it looked like they were just ignoring early warning signs and going ahead because of production pressure. When Columbia happened, it was discovered that there was a similar problem with insulating foam flying off the external tank and hitting the orbiter's wings. Like Challenger, this had begun at the inception of shuttle flight, and again they had normalized the deviance. So you have to say, why didn't they learn from time one to time two? And it's a hard question to answer.
Social psychology looks not only at how we think about and influence others, but how we relate one to another.
People can't survive and thrive now or in any of our history without other people. And so it stands to reason that people would have a very strong motivation to be attached to other people and to be accepted by other people.
Despite this very basic need, relations between people can be marked by aggression and violence, conditions that have biological and psychological undertones.
There's a Dutch family. They have 8 or 9 males convicted of a very severe criminal act. And later on, the scientists discovered that these men actually was missing MLA gene. But when you have a finding in a human, you were not sure whether this is because the missing of this gene or some environment in that family that caused the male give aggressive behavior. So we decided to study in mice, and where we can specifically remove one gene and see if it will result into the same aggressive behavior, and we find this is the case.
A careful look at neural and biochemical influences provides additional clues.
So it may be that testosterone has some priming value for aggression, and certainly males' greater muscular strength plays a role in that. But it's also true that culture primes it and encourages boys with particular kinds of sports, football, for example, which is extremely violent.
People come into my clinic and tell me that their kids go to sleep at night hearing gunfire, and that when fights break out, they've taught their kids to hit the floor so that the bullets coming through the house, they won't be a random victim of a violent act. So that's one breeding ground. At the other end of the spectrum is something that I'm also seeing in my practice, and that is family violence. And that crosses all cultural boundaries, socioeconomic boundaries, and it is where we actually are raising children exposed to that infection within their families.
Boys who have grown up in families where they've witnessed domestic violence have seen men deal with their anger or deal with their frustration or deal with their need for power and control, use abuse as a way to express themselves, as a way to cope. And so it's modeled for them. Girls or females who grow up in those homes think that it's okay for a woman to be abused. They don't know better. They don't know differently. And oftentimes they won't even notice the signs that a relationship's becoming abusive because that's all they know.
There is violence in the Latino culture like there is violence in most cultures. It is not unusual to find family violence. And in addition to that, there is the problem of how Latinos have traditionally disciplined their children. Behaviors that were considered normative in the countries of origin become labeled as child abuse in the United States.
So if you have a culture in which aggression has a lot of functional value, you can get status by being a good aggressor. So under those conditions, you see modeling would be easily adopted and used as a way of dealing with the interpersonal problems and as a way of gaining power and status and so on. But in cultures where aggression is devalued, aggressive modeling would have very little of any impact.
And that third thing in the equation of violence as an epidemic is the media violence. All of our children are exposed to media violence. We are absolute idiots if we deny the fact that media has an impact on a child's mind.
We had participants come in and they played a shooting game, either immersively or desktop. And, what we basically found was that during immersion, people were much more aggressive, even after the game, than they were before. And I think it kind of illustrates the power of immersive technology and the influence it will have on people once it becomes more ubiquitous in society.
We know that a gazillion kids watch violent movies and TV and play with violent video games, and the overwhelming majority of them don't go out and commit mass murder. But having said that, there's fairly good evidence that there's a small group of kids that are exquisitely sensitive to those types of things, and where it can really have a very, very adverse effect on them in terms of promoting violent behavior.
And then the argument becomes, well, how small is the subset before we ought to worry about it? And of course, that depends on what kind of an outcome you're talking about. Are we talking about wearing your pants down on your hips? Are we talking about piercing? Are we talking about shooting? The nature of the effect you're concerned with changes the numbers for you.
People's lives unfold in many different ways. Just as we admit the existence of unspeakable violence, we also observe acts of heroism and unselfish regard for the welfare of others.
A lot of people really helped us out. I mean, they brought Santa Claus to the house and took pictures with Santa Claus, and they were bringing food and made you feel so welcome.
I think one of the most interesting questions theoretically is, why are we good to people? Now, if you go to the foundations of Western science and Western thought, really, the general assumption is that people at their core are selfish. They are guided by selfish impulses, and those impulses are unbounded. Even what appear to be altruistic behaviors, being good to other people, a lot of people believe would be motivated by selfish interests, like, oh, other people will praise me. And yet when you look at daily behavior, people are continually doing things for other people and continually being good when they don't have to be. And I'm interested in what emotions make us good to other people. One obvious one is compassion. And we're starting to do a variety of studies that show compassion has its own physiological response in the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system that is associated with, like, the opening of the chest and the tearing and the welling up of emotion. Another really interesting emotion is awe, the sense of beauty, the sense of wonder, and the sense of elevation or inspiration in things that are bigger than the self. And what we're showing is that this emotion of awe, we believe, gets people to commit to the collective principles. It makes you become devoted to your group and your culture.
It is because of this devotion to group and culture and sincere attempts at cooperation and improved communication that we can begin to chip away at the antagonisms built by years of aggression and conflict.
I was in South Africa last year, and one of the principles that underlay the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was that for whites to be forgiven, amnesty they called it, they had to confess to what they did.
And the nature of the violation is abduction and disappearance.
And the blacks had to come forward and chronicle the abuses that they suffered in order to get reparations. But the whole process was forged on the principle of Ubuntu, which is a kind of principle in which one's well-being is contingent upon another. You can't do good by yourself. You can't be good by yourself. You have to be in relationship to other people. And my humanity is defined in part by my relationship to you. And it was that principle that allowed them to bring people together who had historically been in conflict and in battle in an asymmetrical way, to say that even though you have done these things in the past, we are creating a new society in which we all have value, we all have humanity, and we must move forward.
Inside Out is a 22-part series about psychology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.